Now you're getting ready to complete M1A2, reflecting on a successful college experience. In each of the 5 content modules, you'll notice a pattern. The first assessment or assignment will always be an application, and then the second one will always be a reflection. So how do you go about preparing for this assignment? I wanted to bring back some ideas here just to get you thinking about the process and the level of thinking that you are required to do in the college and on this assignment. So the process for analytical thinking really begins with first gathering information, and then once we go out and we gather all that information, we start to break it into parts. And once we break it into parts, we say these things are similar, these things are different. We start to analyze and evaluate the differences and the similarities between them. And then once we're done examining, we start to see the connections, and we use these connections so that we can build new meaning and understanding. On this assignment, you're going to be asked to, again, answer in 3 different parts. The first part just asks you to simply review. Reviewing, if we're looking at Bloom's taxonomy of higher order thinking, is at the very lowest level. We're really just asking you to recall information that was shared in the study activities. Next, you're going to be asked to explain, and here we start moving up Bloom's taxonomy of higher order thinking. Next and last, perhaps most importantly, you're going to be asked to evaluate. An evaluation we see here at the highest levels. So let's break this down step by step. So part 1 asks that you review the characteristics that promote success on the list below here and determine the 3 characteristics that you think will have the greatest impact on your college experience. Now, this seems kind of easy. Right here, we're really only looking at this lowest level. And at this lowest level, I'm just asking you to repeat, to state, to show that you were going through the same content in the study activities in Chapter 1 that you were required to. You may be surprised to hear this, but very often I get essays that are way off the mark, that students include topics that weren't explicitly addressed in that module or seem to sometimes be pulled out of thin air. That's always a clear indication that students did not read and did not complete the study activities. So let's move on to the next one. The next part has you explain the 3 characteristics that you've selected using evidence from the study activities. This is where we make sure that we are on the same page. If you go to the index, the table of contents in your textbook, you can see each of these characteristics outlined here. You can also use this as a reference for finding the page numbers that you need. Here, in this next part, I'm asking you to explain. Now, when we look at explaining, we can use some words like classify, describe, discuss, identify, translate. Sometimes with our understanding, we immediately start climbing into the application, and this is where we use our real-life experiences to demonstrate our knowledge. Here in this section, it will be essential that you are using the words, using the phrases, citing the researchers as outlined in the chapter or within the study activities. If you're an online student, you're watching these videos at home. If you're in class, we may or may not be watching some of these in class. You can and should reference the ideas of these theorists. So let's take a look at how one student did this. One of the other study activities that you were asked to do was to complete the Assess Your Successful Intelligence Assessment at the end of Chapter 1. Using some of the phrases in this assessment could be another way that you explain the characteristic of analytical thinking. So in this case, this student was outlining the 3 thinking patterns that go into successful intelligence. So here she is defining analytical thinking. And we can see some connections here. So she says, I'm able to evaluate situations. And then we can look at evaluating situations over here. Looking at the pros and cons of situations. We see that again here. It is okay to use the language from the textbook. It is encouraged that you use the language from the study activities. This is where you will gain credibility. You're demonstrating your ability to find the most relevant information so that you can do the important job of explaining. Now, let's take a look at the same student, and she did something similar with emotional intelligence. Here, she was just describing her strengths and her weaknesses. It was a similar but different assignment. Now, here, she defines emotional intelligence very briefly, right? And then here, she starts citing some of the specific abilities from the emotional intelligence assessment that you will have to complete or that you have completed as part of the study activities. Again, this is a wonderful tool for finding the vocabulary to further explain and discuss what the topic is. Now, I'd argue that this student missed an important element here. In her definition and citing and giving some specific details, so these would be your supporting details, she really missed the true definition of emotional intelligence, and that was taken from the textbook on page 13. So let's look at what a redo of this one should or could have looked like. So you can see I've taken her first sentence and then I've added, according to the researchers, and then I define what emotional intelligence is based on the information in the textbook. And we can see this process outlined on page 13. Next, so again, I use some of her phrasing here, but I went a step further. So where she said emotional intelligence is recognizing how I and others feel, I changed that and I said, therefore, emotional intelligence is more than recognizing how I and others feel, but then using this information in a way that is going to manage more positive outcomes. And then the rest of the supporting details are hers. But again, going back and citing a definition from the textbook shows your college professor that you were paying attention in the lecture or that you read the textbook. Again, you're demonstrating that you can find the most relevant information in order to showcase your understanding. Now the last part is perhaps the hardest, and that's because again we are moving up Bloom's taxonomy of higher level thinking. We're looking at evaluation, and sometimes the analysis seems to come hand in hand with that. So here we can look at the ability to draw connections amongst ideas. So often we see this with comparing and contrasting, distinguishing the similarities from the differences, examining the similarities or differences. But then we use this information in order to justify a stand or a decision, right? We want to support or we want to critique our decisions. Some of this represents the habit of critical thinking, and interpretation and evaluation are again some of the tasks of the critical thinking mind. This might be a little bit over your head here, but basically what we're asking you to do is analyze the relationships, see patterns, find the most relevant information, and then be able to identify the most relevant parts of a problem, but do this in a way that is not one-dimensional, that recognizes the context and the complexity of making decisions in our world. So how would this look? So again, I want to point you to the directions where I'm telling you the verbs, right? Your verbs and your directions are telling you exactly what you should be doing. So I'm asking you to evaluate, and we just did a little thinking on that, but then I tell you exactly how. I tell you that I want you to provide examples and then justify these examples. So a really simple strategy from our writing classes, an outline, can help us do this really quickly. So I would start with, in my outline, this would be number one example, one justify, right? So for example, I might write an example of how this might play out in college is this. In college, I must communicate with students and professors who have communication styles and expectations that are different than mine, and this may anger, frustrate, or upset me. These distractions and stressors can negatively impact my focus, comprehension, and ultimately the demonstration of my knowledge on tests or papers. That's an example. This is a common problem that we're going to encounter in college. Therefore, I justify the need for emotional intelligence. Therefore, emotional intelligence will be a critical skill to develop in order to recognize and understand emotions. Again, this is coming from my explanation previously, in a way that will help me manage the situation to make good decisions and communicate clearly. Again, we can see similar language that ties back to language used previously. And then you'll do this 2 more times because you have to justify the 3 characteristics that you identified earlier. Lastly, make sure that you're always using the rubrics. This rubric happens to be a little general, therefore the longer video explaining how to approach each of these parts.